Chapter 6. Surf City. The Californian. The plane came in low over the volcanoes in the first week of April 2019, and the man looking out the window had never seen the country before except as a problem. That was how El Salvador arrived in California, when it arrived at all, as a line item, a caseload, a caravan. 680,000 Salvadorans lived in his state, more than in any other INS, and nearly all of them had come carrying a version of the same story, the one about the thing that happened, the reason it was no longer possible to stay. Gavin Newsom had been governor for 3 months. No California governor had ever come here. A week earlier, the President of the United States had announced he was cutting aid to the region entirely, on the theory that a drowning man swims harder if you take away the rope. California had been arriving on this coast for 40 years, as surf magazines chasing an untouched right, as deportation flights, as a surgeon who misread a swell, but it had never before arrived as a governor. Newsom had come, he said, to see the rope. He went where visitors of his kind went. He stood at the tomb of Oscar Romero in the Metropolitan Cathedral, the archbishop shot through the heart at the altar in 1980 in the war that started everything and ended nothing. He toured the reintegration center where the deportees came through, men stepping off American planes into a country some of them had left as toddlers, holding their lives in a plastic bag. He sat with the human rights lawyers and the priests who negotiated with gangs because someone had to, and he listened to the ledger of the place read aloud, a minimum wage of $300 a month, a murder rate that traded the world's worst title back and forth with war zones, a rate of people driven from their homes second only to Syria's. 'Twas the itinerary of grief. Every foreign official got it. They flew home afterward and said the words root causes and nothing changed, and the coast kept emptying northward, one bus at a time. But there was another meeting on the schedule, with a man who did not want to talk about grief at all. Nayib Bukele was 37 years old and had just been elected president of El Salvador by a margin that ended two political parties in a single night. He would not take office until June. For now, he was a president in waiting, a man in the strange hallway between winning and governing, with nothing to do but plan. He had been a publicist before he was a politician. He had sold things for a living, and what he understood better than any president the country had ever had was that El Salvador's deepest problem might also be a marketing problem. The world had heard exactly one story about his country for 40 years. He intended to tell it a different one. The different story was 40 kilometers south of the capital, down the switchbacks of the Carretera al Puerto de la Libertad, where the land quit abruptly and the Pacific took over. Bukele had campaigned on it. Surf City, he called it, the idea that the wave breaking off Punta Roca, a right-hand point wave that surf magazines had been calling world-class for decades, could do for El Salvador what no aid package ever had. That the coast the country had spent 40 years fleeing was, in fact, the country's rescue. It sounded to the political class like a slogan. It sounded to the coast like the first time anyone in the capital had looked south on purpose. And now here was the governor of California, which had built an empire out of exactly this, which had taken a Polynesian pastime and turned it into an aesthetic, an industry, a shorthand for freedom recognized on every continent, sitting across from him. They were, in certain lights, the same kind of man. Both young for their jobs, both fluent in the camera, both convinced that image was not the opposite of substance but a form of it. And when the conversation turned to the ocean, the room changed. The American ambassador, Jean Monnet, was there. The talk ran to the practical machinery of a coast being readied, roads, clean water, zoning, an environmentally protected corridor along La Libertad. Tourism was up 14% that year, Monnet noted, though the number came with an asterisk the size of the U.S. State Department, whose travel advisory still warned Americans about the country in the language reserved for dangerous places. Newsom offered what California had: the branding people, the tourism office, the accumulated expertise of a state that had spent 70 years selling its own shoreline. Afterward, Bukele said it plainly in English for the cameras. "We want to work together to attract surf tourism." He talked about apps, technology, a generation of Salvadoran kids building software instead of leaving, but the surf came first. The surf was the door. The governor was charmed despite himself. Before he flew home, he and his wife were joking with reporters that they'd come back, not on any official mission next time, but for the waves, the legendary waves. Everyone laughed. It was the lightest moment of a heavy trip, and no one in the room had ever stood on the sand at El Tunco at dusk when the big rock offshore goes black against the burning sky and the lineup bobs in the last light like a congregation that forgot to go home. The plan was made by men who had not been in the water. That same week, 40 kilometers from the handshakes, the coast went about its ancient business. At El Sunzal, the long boarders trimmed across the softest wave in El Salvador. At La Bocana, the river argued with the sea the way it always had. And somewhere between them, at the beach with the rock and the black sand, a young woman from La Libertad paddled out through the morning glare. Catherine Diaz was 20 that April. She had grown up in the water the men in the capital were now describing to each other, had learned it the way you learn a language before you know what grammar is. Her brother coached her from the sand. Her rankings were climbing. If the men in the room were right, if the story could really be changed, then she was the change. Proof, in a rash guard, that a girl from this coast could stand on the country's one inexhaustible resource and ride it somewhere. She knew about the plan, the way everyone on the coast knew, as rumor, as roadwork, as a new hotel going up where a hostel used to be. She could not have known how much of it would come true, that within 2 years the flags of 40 nations would fly over her homebreak, that the president-elect in that room would remake the country around ideas of safety and control that the world would argue about for years, that the story really would change, and that the coast, which had watched every other kind of promise wash out with the tide, would find itself at the center of the new one. The ocean was not in the room in April 2019. It was not consulted. The plan required certain things of it, that it be generous, that it be marketable, that it be safe, and the ocean had never once agreed to be all three. But that morning, it asked nothing of Catherine Diaz except what it had always asked. She read the horizon. A set stood up off the point, gray-green and glassy. She turned her board toward shore, and she went. The bet in 2019, the Salvadoran government announced the Surf City Initiative, a national branding project designed to position El Salvador's Pacific coast as a premier international surf destination. The announcement made official what the surf world had known informally for years. The waves along this coastline were exceptional, and the country had decided to build an identity around them. For the surf community, Surf City's infrastructure improvements were real and immediately visible. Better road access to breaks, improved facilities near competition venues, international events with prize money and media coverage that would have been unimaginable even a few years earlier. The campaign created a feedback loop. Investment attracted better events attracted more international surfers. More international surfers expanded El Salvador's reputation, and expanded reputation attracted more investment. The product at least was real. Within an hour of the airport, the coast held an absurd inventory. The long, forgiving hallway of El Sunzal, Bocanita's quick reef in front of El Tunco, the river-mouth peaks of La Bocana, El Zonte, playful when small and serious when the south swells arrived, soon to be as famous for a Bitcoin experiment as for its right-hander. The points the highway named with all the romance of an odometer, K59 and K61, long fast rights the connected quietly preferred. Mizada, far to the west, lefts and rights and room to be alone. And, though the campaign rarely looked east, Punta Mango and Las Flores, waves that travelers cross the world for. Presiding over all of it was Punta Roca, the benchmark, the reason the magazines had come long before the ministers did. None of it was anyone's doing. The points face squarely into the path of the Pacific's storm-born energy. The rock beneath them is volcanic and permanent, so the waves repeat themselves year after year, faithful as scripture, and at dawn, the land breathes offshore, combing every face clean. The government had not built the product. It had at last put up signage. By the end of 2020, the bet had survived even a global pandemic. The ISA had committed its World Surfing Games, the final qualifier for surfing's Olympic debut, to La Bocana and El Sunzal, and a country the world had spent 40 years being warned about was preparing to host 40 nations on its beaches. Down on the coast, the campaign arrived the way national projects always arrive in small places, as roadwork, as scaffolding, as a new hotel going up where a hostel used to be. The fishermen still launched before first light, the kids still surfed before school. And the wave at Punta Roca, which had been world-class long before anyone thought to say so on a billboard, went on breaking exactly as it always had, indifferent to the slogan now painted above it, available as it had always been to anyone willing to paddle out and meet it. C.